I am Dr. David Croto, and I'm here with Dr. Rick Christman, and we're going to talk about leadership, specifically servant leadership. So what would be an effective definition of servant leadership?
That's a great question. Let me back away from that just for a moment as we enter into what an understanding of servant leadership is. I hear especially in religious circles, academic or in church, the term servant leadership being thrown around, and nobody ever really takes time to define it. No, so it leaves the audience or those who are attentive to the phrase servant leadership. What does it really mean? And so I've studied under different individuals who have taken time to articulate a clear understanding, theoretical you might call it, but practical as well. And I think that's the essential part of understanding servant leadership. It's not just a catchphrase, as it often is used as such, but it's got a strong biblical context, but it also has the opportunity for us to apply it in organizations today, not just churches. There are a number, and I'll share this a little bit later, but there are a number of organizations that actively seek to be servant-led organizations. But when you look at the definition, Dr. Jim Lobb, who I studied under at Indiana Wesleyan University, created a definition that I think is probably the most applicable to organizations. And what he says is it's an understanding and practice of leadership that places the good of those led over the self-interest of the leader. And then he goes on to say it promotes the valuing and developing of people, the building of community, the practice of authenticity, the providing of leadership for the good of those led, and the sharing of power and status for the common good of each individual, the total organization, and those that it serves. And where he derives his definition from would be from Robert Greenleaf. I think as we begin to think about, servant leadership, and servant leadership as a concept actually precedes Christ, but Jesus talked about servant leadership, or at least the principles of servant leadership. If you want to lead, you have to be willing to be last, and it really flips the model of autocratic leadership upside down and begins to help organizations and those who seek to embrace that model and helps them to focus on the people and the organization. Robert Greenleaf, if you've ever read his work, tends to be an abstract writer, so you're left wondering exactly, what does he intend in his writing as it relates to servant leadership. Dr. Larry Spear, who was the executive director of the Greenleaf Center, in 1992, he began to read through Greenleaf's work and began to extract what he felt like were the 10 principles of servant leadership. What are they? And he says there are 10 things that he extracted from those writings, and those being listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization. He talks about foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community.
And all of those are part of being a servant leader.
All of those are part of being a servant leader. One of the concerns, if I can put a concern to the concept of servant leadership, is that oftentimes theorists and writers of servant leadership tend to put a very descriptive understanding of servant leadership, and oftentimes it's not prescriptive. How do we apply that? And I think if you read Larry Spear's work, you'll find that he helps you to take the principle and apply it to a particular setting. But we have to go further than just saying here's the description of servant leadership. Here's how it is applied. Here's how it can be made an essential part of how we lead within an organization.
Well, speaking of that, is servant leadership a viable option for organizational leadership?
It is. In fact, having attended the Greenleaf Servant Leadership Conference, there are a number, even if you go and Google it right now, you're going to find a number of organizations that embrace servant leadership, like the Container Store or Marriott International. Another one would be Starbucks or Nordstrom's. Those are organizations that are actively pursuing servant leadership as the model within their organization. I remember even listening to the CEO of Southwest Airlines when they were embracing this concept as well. And if you go back to the beginning of who they were with Herb Kelleher, who was their first CEO, he would literally work the flight line, baggage handling at Thanksgiving to give somebody the opportunity to go home and spend time with their family. And so it starts at the top, so to speak. You know, I said we turned the model upside down, but it really starts with the person in charge. And you can have individuals who are seeking to be servant leaders within the organization individually, but if you're going to make it an organizational mandate or an organizational approach, it has to start with the person who's leading the organization, and it has to filter out into all the different aspects. And it's the expectations, it's how we approach and understand people. So it's very much an effective ideal.
With so much research done on this, so many groups practicing this, why is it so easily misunderstood?
Because, and that's a really good question, and the reason that often happens is because it's perceived as being passive, right? A passive approach. And so and this is where I really feel strongly when I hear the phrase servant leadership being used or being thrown around. People say, well, we want to be servant leaders. And the first thing I want to ask when somebody says that, you know, in a training seminar or in a classroom or in a church, we want to be servant leaders. What does that mean? That's what I want to ask, you know. What does that mean to you for them to be servant leaders? Does that mean just being kind? I always ask my students this question: can servant leaders fire somebody? And it causes pause for a moment. They're like, can a servant leadership or a servant leader fire somebody? Well, certainly they can. And it's essential. It's, again, putting the needs of the persons and the needs of the organization ahead of myself. And it isn't autocratic. So in other words, it's just not what the leader has to say and everybody has to do it. But it's also the good of the person. Sometimes the best thing that's ever happened to somebody is, and this is going to sound mean, but it's not intended to be so. Sometimes the best thing that happens is to be fired, because maybe it's a wake-up call, or maybe it's God's way of saying, and I'm not saying God fires us, right? But maybe it's God's way of saying, I really want you here, not here. And so I think we have to get away from a passive understanding of servant leadership and understand that as a leader who leads from a servant mindset. Greenleaf says it like this. He says, a servant leader is servant first. So it's about serving the organization, and it's about serving the people within that organization, right? And so at every level. And so a leader, and then as we embed that as a culture within the organization, it's everybody doing that. So no matter what level you're at, it's putting the organization first. It's putting the people that serve with me first. And what we tend to do is to look at servant leadership as just, well, you love everybody. You know, we're just being kind. We can't have hard discussions. And it's not that at all. It's not passive. But that's where it gets left, is this passive approach to leadership, when in fact it's just a different paradigm. Bill Millard and Jim Law worked together. They created an understanding that there are three different paradigms of leadership. There's the autocratic, which is top down, right? There's paternalistic. They talk about the negative paternalistic and the positive paternalistic, which oftentimes positive paternalistic feels like servant leadership, but the leader's acting more like a parent, not a leader. And then we look at servant leadership. What does it really mean to be a servant leader? And it's putting the good of others ahead of our own. And it's easy for leaders, you know, especially in our world today, for leaders to be narcissistic, right? And to put their needs first, and you know, to elevate themselves. And when you hear them speak, they elevate themselves, When in fact a true servant leader is going to do what? Elevate the organization,
Right.
elevate those who lead with them or serve with them within the organization. So we've got to move away from that passive understanding of servant leadership and say, no, it can be an aggressive model if it's handled properly and understood in a way that allows it to be what it was intended to be.
So you believe major organizations can adopt and use this approach to leadership?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a paradigm. So it's more than just a theory, or it's more than just an approach, but it is a paradigm of leadership in which encompasses the whole organization, where we train. And some people would say, well, can people be servant leaders aside from being Christian? I think that gets tied into the conversation. I think for Christians and organizations that are Christians, if they understand this model, they may embrace it quicker than somebody who's not. But right. Greenleaf is a great example of this. He was an AT&T executive for years, and I really feel that he brought to the table an opportunity for what we might say non-Christian organizations to embrace this model, because it's really changing the focus, right, of the people within the organizations. Helping, where's my focus? Who am I focused on? What's the vision of the organization? What's the purpose of this organization? How do we help people to focus on the organization itself and others within the organization, and not myself?
That's great.
But we live in a very, again, a narcissistic culture that teaches and trains us it's all about me. And servant leadership says it's not all about you. It's about the organization. It's about the people that you're serving within that organization. How do I help them to be better?
Those are some great insights. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.